guys, and welcome back to this new video. And this video is all about making up stories, preparing stories, storytell in general. I'm so excited for this topic because storytell is a big part of my life. I also think I'm pretty qualified to make this video as I have a degree in filmmaking, and filmmaking, a big part of it is storytelling. Script writing was one of my favorite parts of filmmaking. Now I'm studying animation, for which I also have to do from time to time storytell. And there is just so much to storytelling, making up stories that we can dive into. I'm assuming that most of the people that watch this video are into writing stories themselves, behind their laptop, their notebook, writing books. And that's something I also like to do, but I do this in my spare time. I have no degree in literature, like really books with research and everything. I think I started that when I was 12, 14, 13, somewhere around that age. I want to talk in this video about the different things I do beforehand, before I start writing, because I think the writing part or the filming part or the animation part is a whole different thing. But before you can write a story or a script, there are a lot of steps that can help you, preventing you from plot holes or making sure you have a great dynamic between characters. You can think about the structure you want to use in your story. If it has 3 acts, 2 acts, whether the storytelling is linear or you work with flashbacks, flash forwards. Is there one perspective you're telling the story of? Are there more perspectives? There is so much to think about beforehand. Also the themes, the topics, what do we need to know before we start making the setting, designing the setting. What is the world it's happening in? What is important to know? What are rules? There is just so much you can dive into beforehand. Also making a synopsis, a treatment. These are tools that can help you make the best of your research beforehand. And since I had an epiphany last night for a new story, which I'm pretty excited about, I thought I can take you with me in my process. But I do want to point out that I'm not really going that much into the visual aspect. I will talk about mood boards, but not in the sense of, for example, for animation we make color sheets and character sheets. That's something I won't talk about in this video because I think that's a whole different thing on its own. So what I already did before I came up with this story idea was brainstorming, writing everything down that came into my mind, the ideas, the different potential storylines, the different characters that I already had thought of, potential names for the characters, just brainstorming a work in progress name, because we can always change the name. Writing down questions, not only ideas, but sometimes I have the concept and then I know that there are different perspectives from which you can tell the story, which will get a whole different point of view or a whole different story. Sometimes the most small decisions can alter the story completely. So really writing these down so that I can think about it. Also, what comes with this is already doing some research. Once you have a very specific storyline, you can go deep diving into the main topics. But beforehand, I like to do just some light reading on the topic, some Googling it. What are the most common facts around the topics that we know? For example, for me, I'm writing a story in which tarot plays a big role. So I will be looking around the cards. What's the meaning of all the cards? Just the general stuff. But for example, for my animation, maybe I will link it here that you can watch it. It's a 20-second animation, first animation I ever made. I know that I did learn so much from it, and I'm very proud of that as what I could do at that moment, but I know that I could do better right now. So it's always a learning process. Anyway, for that story, which goes about depression and having dark thoughts, I also did research more deeply about this. How often do we see this by children? How do we visualize this in stories? and just more of the deeper things, even though you don't necessarily see them back in animation. But if there's something I have learned from my experience so far is you can never do too much research. The more you know, the better. Especially if you're working with other people, make sure you know so much, because they are gonna ask you questions. Why do you choose this storyline? Why do you choose this as your main character? Why does it have these quirks? Why are they going here instead of there? There is even the smallest things. For example, is there a special reason you gave them this name? Is there a special reason they ate this for breakfast? I don't know. I think how more professional, how more important this is. But try to leave no room for coincidence. But I've been talking so much right now. I will take you along on my journey the upcoming days. So I always like to prepare my stories with Notion. So in my Notion, I created a page for this specific story. I gave it a work in progress title, and I made a few sub pages, one for brainstorming, one for the chapters, one for the character database, and one for world building. And then I just had all the places to put my ideas. What I do is not always the same order. I also work more intuitive, but you have to make your own order. If you love to be very structured, then that's your way to go. But I know that if I get stuck on a specific thing, I like to move on to the next thing. And I hope that this gives me the inspiration to get new inspiration for the part that I was stuck on. For example, I have many storyline ideas, but I have not enough ideas yet to decide what will be the inciting incident, what will be the first act, the second act, the third act, because I want a linear storytell with a 3-act structure. And if you don't know what an inciting moment is, an inciting incident is, that's the moment your main character's life gets a spin. That's actually the moment the struggle arrives and it's a call to action. But I have still some things that I'm stuck on, and I am now leaving the storyline for what it is, and I'm focusing on my characters. Because maybe if I work out my characters, their quirks, their personality, their connections to each other, maybe, or my storyline will become more character driven, and maybe that gives some new insights. Because that's something you can also decide for yourself. Do you want it to be storyline driven? In that case, you should work on your storyline first thing. Or do you want it to be more character driven? Then you need to work out your characters first. So I will show you what I did already. You could see this morning. I have my Notion set up. We had to brainstorm. These were some ideas. And then we went to the chapters. That's something that I only made a page for. I let that be for now because I first want the storyline before I divide it into chapters. Because I also need to know whether a chapter belongs to the first act, second act, third act. And then now I want to work on my character database. So that's what I want to do now. I don't go into depth around my character database because I made an in-depth video about this. It's on my channel. It's called Making a Character Database in Notion, I think. But I also will link it here. Then I go back to my storyline later on. So what I did was making a timeline. Like I said, I struggled with my storyline, so I decided to use some bullet points to make my timeline clear. I just wrote down the main events and in which order they happened, so that I get a more sense of all the events that I need to divide in my chapters, and this will help me write my synopsis, my treatment, and also my summaries for the chapters. So the next thing I want to do after I have written down my treatment, the main events, it was not really a treatment, but the main events of the story, so that I know what it is that I need to know before I can start writing the story. In case I didn't mention what a treatment is basically your whole story on one page. Since I now have an idea of what my story contains, one of the upcoming steps is to write down a small summary for every chapter. And I know that I am moving quite sporadically through my preparation phase, but what I like to do first is to make a map and go on I'm actually, by the way, going on Pinterest, constantly pinning everything that brings some inspiration, gives me some visual ideas, visual clues for the story. By looking at those pins, getting inspiration, I will draw a map. And this doesn't need to be a fancy map, but for me personally, I like this because it gives me some idea of where every location is, and then I can use this knowledge in my chapters, because sometimes if you have to travel very far for a place, it makes it just easier for me. But once again, this is how I am doing it, and you can do your own way through the preparation phase like you want to do it, but these are some key things that I do. How I like to make my map is on Procreate, but before I had Procreate, I did this just on plain paper, but now I like Procreate better because it gives me room to play with the size of things, because I can scale it down, scale it up, and easily replace locations. Do a quick little list of all the rooms that I want there to be. Oh my god, the sun is so bright. I only can be extra because I did some... You saw me say that I wanted to make the list. Well, this is the list now. And now we're going on Pinterest. You can already see that I've been pinning stuff that fits my story, and that's what we'll be doing now, more specifically because I made the list. And then I will go on with making the actual map, because that's still practically nothing. So now it's time to decide how many chapters there will be and what will be in which chapter. So basically a main layout. And this is something different than a treatment, which I would recommend making a treatment first. Like I said, a treatment is one paper full of your story. It summarizes the story, the key plot points, and once you've written this, you have a clear view on how the story develops, and then you can go to making the chapters. I will be working with a 3-act structure. I will walk you through it quite quickly, but there are different act structures, but I'm most comfortable with this one. I've chosen to not work with flash forwards or flashbacks. You can work with flash forwards and flashbacks in a 3-act structure, but there are more intriguing structures for flash forwards and flashbacks. But there's so much to find on the internet, so I would recommend doing some research first. But if you're fairly new to working with structures like that, I would recommend a linear storytelling, a 3-act structure. If you work with flashbacks or flash forwards, place them in such a way that it's clear for the reader where they are in the story, if they are in the past, the present, or the future. Oh, sorry, I bumped you. But for a 3-act structure, you have the first act, which is basically a chapter for introduction, a chapter for setting the story, who is your character, what is about to happen, and then you end the first act with the inciting incident. Often you want the inciting incident. This is something that triggers the reader. That's when you enter the second act, which is basically the story evolving, your main character dealing with their problem, learning to implement their new lifestyle that they have to adapt to once the inciting incident happened, getting from point A to B. The second act mostly ends, and that's also where the third act starts, around a point where you think everything is getting finally better. They are reaching their goal and everything seems perfect, and then bam, things get even worse than they were during the second act. There seems to be no escape, no possibility for a happy ending, and that's where your third act is about. It's about how they deal with this new problem that arises and how they solve this in order to get the happy ending you want, or in case you don't want a happy ending, not a happy ending. With this structure you can also structure your which are the chapters for the first act, which are the chapters for the third act. That's how you can fill in your chapters. And how I like to do it is go to my Notion or your notebook or whatever you're working with to store all your information, your data that you gather around your story. And then I do chapters, and I work with the toggling, and I do the title of the chapter, or just chapter 1 if I want to do the titles of the chapters at the end, or I don't name them at all. And then once I toggle, I can do a quick summary. And that's how I make my chapters. I have another tip for if you tend to put too much detail in your story, because that can be something that is distracting for the reader. Sometimes, especially when you write fantasy, you feel like you have to do so much writing to set the world, like give the reader a proper idea of how the world feels, looks, is like, and that can often distract us from the real storyline. So to find out for yourself what the main storyline is, what the most important part of your story is, I would recommend writing a synopsis, a logline. They are so compact. One is 1 line, one is 3-4 lines that summarize your story. And then you have to force yourself to look what is important, what is less important, what is the main purpose of the story, what's the main storyline, what is the story about. And with that in mind, you can be much more precise in what it is you need to write about, because that's what your story is about. And once you do all this, have your mood board, your research, your character list, everything that's important before you start, you can actually start writing. But I only wanted to tap on the preparation phase. I don't want to get into the writing phase, the production phase. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please comment, like, subscribe. And if you like this, I can also start a series, because I already have the character database. Can also dive into the more concept art phase, although this is not my strongest point, but I'm learning. I'm still studying animation, for which concept art is something very important, and I'm growing as a person, so I can also give you some tools that I use to get better at my practices, what the different layers of concept art are, because there's so much to dive into. But I can also show you if it's about the production of writing a book, which I haven't done professionally. I want to make that clear, but I can show you. Looks like what I do, what are the tools that I'm using, how do I get into the writing zone. Yeah, so thank you for watching. I hope I see you in my next video. Bye.